Urgent question, Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Foreign Secretary if she will make a statement on the state of emergency declared in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are closely monitoring the fast-moving and fluid political, economic and security situation in Sri Lanka. The Minister of State for South Asia has engaged directly with our High Commissioner and team on the ground. We encourage all sides to find a peaceful, democratic and inclusive approach to resolving the current political and economic challenges. Sri Lanka's political and economic challenges should be resolved through an inclusive and cross-party process. Any transition of power should be peaceful, constitutional and democratic, and I call on all parties to exercise restraint and refrain from violence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A state of emergency has been declared in Sri Lanka by Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe after President Rajapaksa fled the country last night. This follows weeks of protests on the island, with inflation running at more than 50%, rocketing the price of everyday goods. The health system is on the verge of collapse due to lack of medicine. There is no fuel for essential transport services and medical vehicles. There have been power cuts, school closures, and we woke this morning to protesters overtaking the Prime Minister's office, tear gas fired by police, a curfew imposed on the capital, and the national TV broadcast suspended. This is a crisis in democracy, decades in the making. The world turned away when the Rajapaksa government cluster-bombed its own people committing genocide, murdered its journalists and enriched a small group led by one family. Their malign dynastic control has stripped the country bare, leaving behind a broken nation on the brink of economic collapse. Sri Lanka is unable to buy essential goods from abroad and for the first time in its history failed to make a payment on its foreign debt, a consequence of swinging populist tax cuts at the time of economic instability. Tory leadership candidates, beware. An IMF bailout is essential. But does the Minister agree with me that any financial assistance must go hand in hand with democratic and human rights reforms, particularly for the Tamil community, who continue to fight for truth, justice and accountability as a result of the human rights abuses perpetrated at the end of the civil war by the outgoing Rajapaksa regime?
I'm grateful for the honourable member for her question. As I say, that we have been monitoring this very fast-moving and fluid situation, and both kind of political, economic and security one too. And as in her question as well, we urge for a peaceful and democratic transition in line with the Constitution and the rule of law. As I say, the Minister for South Asia has been thoroughly engaged with the team on the ground in the High Commission. And also, I'd just like to kind of stress that actually he visited Sri Lanka earlier this year and specifically met with a range of civil society groups to discuss the human rights situation. And he also, at the time as well, met with ministers, for instance, including the President and the Foreign Minister, and urged them to take steps to improve human rights and deliver justice and accountability following the conflict. But I'd like to reassure the House, we are kind of closely monitoring the situation on the ground, a very, very fast-moving and fluid situation.
Dr. Matthew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it a pity that some people are seeking to use this debate as to perform criticism of the government in Sri Lanka as it currently is. And the Honourable Lady can chunt it from a sedentary position, but the elephant in the room isn't about the governance of Sri Lanka. It's actually about the decision in 2019 to become an organic country within 10 years, which has led to food shortages, which has led to overseas remittances not being returned. The problem in Sri Lanka is there's no food for people to eat. So what the British government need to do is to assist that country and to assist agencies to ensure that only food, fuel and other supplies are provided. We need to come to our Commonwealth country in its time of great crisis, not make silly political statements.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend for his question. And as I say, we are monitoring this very closely. But actually, in answer to one of the points that he made, but also a point the honourable lady made, the UK economic support is forthcoming through multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The UK is the joint fifth largest shareholder in the IMF and is a major contributor to the UN and World Bank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome this urgent question to an emerging situation brought by the Honourable Member for Mitchelton and Morden, who I know is a long-standing and consistent friend of Sri Lanka. And as we speak, Sri Lanka is convulsed by political and economic crisis. Months of mounting economic difficulties and political mismanagement have led to a chronic shortage of basic goods and medicines, large numbers of people on the streets demanding systemic change to the political system. Reports now indicate that President Rajapaksa has fled to the Maldives in a military jet rather than resigning and facing the consequences, leaving the country in political paralysis and the announcement of a state of emergency. While I sincerely hope that a new government with popular support can be swiftly formed, from past evidence we know that the Sri Lankan people have experienced extrajudicial killings and human rights abuses, and the fear is that amidst the chaos and the latest announcement may lead to increases in community tensions, reprisals or further examples of human rights abuses. And as a member of the Commonwealth family, this would be completely unacceptable, and I have to say I'm unimpressed by the Minister's response to date and the fact that this urgent question was laid for her boss, the Foreign Secretary. Instead, we do have a ministerial response, which is a pattern that's emerging this week in Parliament. But what is clear is that the Sri Lankan people will need our help, and quickly, not only in the days and weeks ahead as they grapple with the chronic shortages and political instability, but in the months and years beyond to secure a brighter and more stable future. Two brief questions, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, the Minister will know that I wrote to her on the 29th of June asking for a response with this emerging situation. This is not new. It's been bubbling away for 2-3 weeks, and yet I have not had a response to my inquiry. Would she give this House the courtesy of a reply and confirm that on her return to the office she will have officers draft a response reflecting the updated situation overnight? And secondly, could she outline the more immediate support offered to Sri Lanka, the engagement with partners in the region, including India, and whether the government will now redouble efforts to bring to justice those implicated in human rights abuses in Sri Lanka? We have this unique opportunity not only to support an ally, a friend and a member of the Commonwealth during their time of need, but help to bring peace, justice and a more sustainable and brighter future to the Sri Lankan people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I'm just going to remind people, and I've said it before, if we go over time, I will cut them off. Please stick to the allocated time. That's the grounds that we grant UQs. Please, Minister.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. On one of the points, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful for her welcoming me to the dispatch box to answer the question, because, quite frankly, we do answer many questions on behalf of the Foreign Office. So I don't think it's very unusual to find me standing here at the dispatch box for an urgent question. In terms of her letter, I would be more than happy to respond to the letter after the debate. I'm not going to go over many of the things I've already said before. All I would say is there are a number of these the situation on the ground, a number of the stories. I don't want to speculate. It is a very fast-moving situation. It's fluid, and we are monitoring it very closely. And I would also say the Minister for South Asia has been working very closely on this matter and does raise human rights issues.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Clearly, the dire economic situation forced by ex-President Rajapaksa and his outfit lie at the heart of what's going on in Sri Lanka Does the Minister agree with me that the risk is that, given Sri Lanka's indebtedness to China and the prospect of cheap fuel from Russia, that country, Sri Lanka, stands every risk of falling within the maw of malign jurisdictions? Will she therefore do everything in her power to ensure that the IMF is engaged to try to sort out this, particularly since part of the issue would appear to be uncosted, unfunded, populist, inflationary tax cuts from 2019, which I'm very sure the IMF will take a very severe view of?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question, and I think what I would like to reassure him is that UK economic support is forthcoming through multilateral institutions like the IMF.
SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sri Lanka is a wonderful place with wonderful people, and I'm sure all our hearts go out to them during this terrible crisis, which has been, as members have said, brewing a long time in the making. This needs concerted international effort to get through the immediate humanitarian crisis. Now, the UN Humanitarian Needs and Priorities Plan has called for $47.2 million in short-term emergency aid. I appreciate the Minister might not give us a number today, but can she confirm the UK will be contributing to that? Also, on accountability, the fact that the President's fled, he can't flee accountability. Would the Minister agree with me that him and all his officials complicit in acts of humanitarian abuses will be held accountable and must be held accountable, and the UK will contribute to those efforts? And on the wider point, this was triggered by economics, as we've heard, with inflation at 54% this month, last month likely to be 70% this month, and that's a terrible cost of living crisis for the ordinary Sri Lankans. Now, that was triggered in part by unmanageable debt. Now, the UK is in an important position in the IMF and the World Bank, and this doesn't just apply to Sri Lanka. And I fear that there's other countries having trouble with unmanageable debt as well. What talks has the Minister had on that? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If I start with the humanitarian support, I would like to provide kind of reassurance that we remain very, very concerned about the impact of the economic and political situation on the humanitarian crisis, and we're working with the United Nations and its agencies in coordination of their Human Needs and Priorities Plan. With regards to accountability, as Sri Lanka enters a new political settlement, the UK will maintain its advocacy on the importance of justice and accountability for alleged war crimes and human rights violations from the war. And this remains crucial for building on peace-building efforts supported through the UNHCR process and for social cohesion.
Sir David.
Madam Speaker, can I first of all congratulate the Honourable Lady, the Member for Mitcham Ward, on securing this question? And can I agree with her that this horrible, appalling situation for the people of Sri Lanka has been brought about by the corruption of the Rajapaksa government, their populist unfunded tax cuts, their skyrocketing defence expenditure, their draconian police powers, and the cronyism corruption the like we've rarely ever seen. And therefore, can I urge the Minister to work with international partners for a full economic and political solution to support the Democrats in Sri Lanka? Can we start with an economic package with the IMF and others so we can give immediate support? But can that be followed and included with a political package which includes an international arrest warrant for President Rajapaksa and his cronies? Can it also include a demand for political freedom, the respect of rights and human rights of everyone on the island of Sri Lanka, including the Tamil and Muslim minorities?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think what I would like to kind of reiterate is that, the political and economic challenges should be resolved through an inclusive and cross-party process. We encourage all sides to find a peaceful, democratic and inclusive approach. And of course we do work with our international partners on this matter, and I think I've already set out the economic support that we've provided through multilateral institutions such as the IMF, World Bank and also organisations like the UN.
Valerie Fass.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there is a large diaspora of Sri Lankan people who live here who are desperately worried about their family back in Sri Lanka. So, and the Minister has made no mention of the Prime Minister's involvement. So could she, at the end of this urgent question, ask the Prime Minister to pick up the phone to the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka and ask him to stop firing at innocent people?
I'm grateful for the Honourable Lady's question. I think one of the things I quite understand, the point that she's making, that there are family here, there's a diaspora here who are concerned about their family, and I can completely understand that. As I said earlier on, I would like to reassure the House that the Minister for South Asia is in regular dialogue with the High Commission and the team on the ground in order to be able to kind of keep an up-to-date view on the situation there. After all, it is incredibly fluid and fast-moving.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, visited Sri Lanka in 2013, and after that, the UK with Sri Lanka jointly moved a resolution at the United Nations Human Rights Council setting out a mechanism for resolving the legacy of the issues we've heard about today. That Sri Lanka has largely ignored its obligations under that resolution since then. In the last 3 years, it's not even paid lip service to them. Will it be a requirement of the medium-term support that's going to be needed for Sri Lanka that it does come back into compliance with its obligations under the decisions of the United Nations Human Rights Council?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think what I'd like to say on this is through our leadership at the UN Human Rights Council process that we've been encouraging Sri Lanka to respect democratic and international human rights standards as Sri Lanka makes its political transition. And it was in March this year that the UK government and our core group of partners led an ambitious new resolution on Sri Lanka at the UNHCR.
Barry Gardner.
Thousands of Tamil in my constituency of Brent North are deeply concerned, but they look back to a history in 2013 where the then coalition government supported the move to have Chogam in Sri Lanka. They look back to the measures that the UK government took when part of the European Union to end GSP Plus, to reinstate GSP Plus, to give the trade preferences back to Sri Lanka, all of which this side of the House advised against at that time, saying that this government in Sri Lanka was no more than a kleptocracy. And that is what has now been proven. So the Minister really does need to outline the measures that she's going to take to support a new, strong, inclusive and democratic government in that state.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I've been clear throughout that we all encourage all sides to find that peaceful, democratic and inclusive approach to resolving the situation. And I can stress to the House that the Minister for South Asia has been doing exactly that in terms of calling for that, but also engaged with the High Commission on the ground and through all of his kind of ministerial contact.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and indeed the Minister would agree that dismissing any woman's urgent question in this House as silly is disrespectful to the subject matter that we have in hand, because we all recognise how serious the situation is. The member might chunter from a sedentary position, but the women are talking now, and we're talking about human rights, because many of us recognise the United Nations told us over 100,000 Tamils were potentially killed during the 26-year-long genocide. The Minister will know that the UNHCR has been investigating this matter, and further to my colleague from nearby colleague from East Ham, I do apologise, it's been a long day, it's a hot day. There is due to be a report, there is due to be further criticism of the resolution that's at the United Nations. Can she tell us whether she's had any talks with the United Nations as to whether that timetable will vary, and when might our constituents finally see justice for the Tamil communities arise?
I'm grateful for the Honourable Lady for her question, and what I would say is given the situation on the ground, it is a very serious matter. We are seeing deeply concerning scenes, and so I'm more than happy to be at this dispatch box answering the question. As I've said throughout, we are concerned about the human rights environment in Sri Lanka, and those concerns are quite wide-ranging, from the harassment of civil society groups, the range of civilian functions brought under military control, increased anti-Muslim sentiment, and the reversal of progress on post-conflict accountability and reconciliation. But I would like to reassure the House, we do lead the way in the UNHRC in terms of the process, and we will encourage Sri Lanka to respect democratic and international human rights standards.
Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as we've heard today, Sri Lanka is a Commonwealth country, and there are very deep community ties across the UK to many towns and cities, and I want to pay tribute to the local Sri Lankan community in Berkshire. Will the Minister set out in some detail in her response, as she's committed to write to my honourable friend, will she set out in some detail what the UK is going to do in terms of supporting the IMF process, bilateral aid of any type that we can offer, and also action on potential human rights matters as well?
I am grateful for the honourable gentleman for his question, and I know I will, of course, be writing to the honourable lady following this urgent question. What I would say is that we are well within the timeframes of answering responding to the letter itself.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The human rights abuses of the Sri Lankan police force have been well documented, and it's been clear in their response to the widespread protests that we've seen that their unacceptable treatment of the people in Sri Lanka, and particularly the Tamil community, and their draconian powers have been a key contributor to the current unrest. Now, the UK government has been funding police training in Sri Lanka, despite clear evidence of these abuses. Can the Minister confirm whether those police and security forces involved in the response to these protests have received funding from the UK government, and will she commit to ending this funding as soon as possible?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. So the UK's police training in Sri Lanka has focused on the role of women in the police service and improving responses to sexual and gender-based violence. Police Scotland have confirmed that they will not seek to participate in any future programmes in Sri Lanka.
Sam Tarry.
Speaker. Madam Speaker, I wonder if the Right Honourable Member, the Minister, would agree with me that the UK Government must bring play its role in bringing a peaceful transition to a democratically elected government in Sri Lanka, which is inclusive and allows for the self-determination of all of the peoples of the island of Sri Lanka. And with that, make forward representations that the new Sri Lankan government must be formed with a new constitution that is pluralist, ensures long-term stability and prosperity, as well as self-determination for all communities on that island. And crucially, that once that government has been formed, it ratifies the Rome Statute so that accountability of mass atrocities and alleged genocide can finally be agreed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I've said a number of times, we do encourage all sides to find that peaceful, democratic and inclusive approach. And we do urge for that transition to be in line with the Constitution and rule of law.
Margaret Ferrier.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it has been reported that doctors in Sri Lanka have had to resort to using social media to try and source critical medicine and equipment. Will the UK Government be providing any support for the nation's medical community to help ensure Sri Lankans can access urgent medical treatment when needed?
So I am very grateful for the honourable lady for her question, and what I would like to reassure her is that we are providing humanitarian support for those in Sri Lanka.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for her response. What aid is the Minister and Government able to make available for those who rely on tourism for their income and who find themselves starving, which seems to be the story at the moment? And what contact has been made to ascertain if the NGOs or the churches, and there's many church groups, I know from my constituency, I have some as well, who have the capacity to distribute aid to those not involved in the unrest, but who are watching their children starve just because of the very things that are happening on the streets of Sri Lanka?
I would like to reassure the honourable gentleman that my colleague, the Minister for South Asia, did actually meet with a number of civil society and NGOs earlier in the year when he actually visited Sri Lanka.
Gareth Thomas.
Very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. What the Minister may not know is that Tory MP after Tory MP has taken trips funded by the Rajapaksa government to this very troubled island. And as a result, it's always been striking the lack of criticism of the Rajapaksa government on human rights and governments. I do hope the Minister will be able to tell the House that the Foreign Office had absolutely no involvement at all in the escape of Mr Rajapaksa from Sri Lanka. And can she reassure the House too that if the people of Sri Lanka want him back to face trial for corruption and poor governance, that Britain will play its role in helping get him back from the Maldives?
Yeah. I'm really disappointed, actually, that of the nature of that question. We are seeing a situation on the ground where I am stood here at the dispatch box because what we want is a peaceful, democratic and inclusive approach so that, we've talked earlier on about, families who were worried about families in Sri Lanka. We've been calling for restraint and a refrain from violence. So I'm just not going to accept that question.